Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, producer Sanjoy K. Roy, and all our colleagues from Teamwork Arts, we are pleased to welcome you to the virtual edition of JLF Toronto 2022. Identities morph and change with borders and geographies. How do diasporic writers address displacement-driven themes of rootlessness, marginalization, fragmentation, alienation, nostalgia, assimilation, adaptation, multiculturalism, and more in their work? A fascinating session on the locational and cultural identities of diasporic writers and the ways in which this blends into their storytelling and quest for belonging. Diksha Basu is the internationally best-selling author of the novels The Windfall and Destination Wedding. Shauna Singh Baldwin is the award-winning author of the novels What the Body Remembers, The Tiger Claw, and The Selector of Souls. Her collections comprise English lessons and other stories. And we are not in Pakistan. Baldwin's latest works include the play We Are So Different Now and Reluctant Rebellions. Kathy Friedman is the author of the short story collection All the Shining People. She studied creative writing at UBC and the University of Gulf and was a finalist for the Writers' Trust Bronwyn Wallace Award for Emerging Writers. Currently, Friedman teaches in Humber College's Bachelor of Creative and Professional Writing program and is also the co-founder and artistic director of Inkwell Workshops. Anar Ali's first book, Baby Khaki's Wings, a collection of short stories, was a finalist for multiple awards including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Night of Power, her debut novel, was published to critical acclaim in Canada, the Indian subcontinent and Germany. She also works as a screenwriter in films and TV. Siddhesh Inamdar is an editor at the Toronto-based The Walrus magazine. Before moving to Canada this year, he was a non-fiction editor at HarperCollins India for close to a decade, working with award-winning and best-selling authors such as APJ Abdul Kalam, Raghuram Rajan, Achal Malhotra, A.S. Dulat, Girish Kuber, Alpa Shah, Kavita Iyer, and Shantanu Naidu, among numerous others. He is also the author of the novel The Story of the Long-Distance Marriage and 3 books for young adults. All our sessions can be viewed on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Do follow our social media pages at JLF Litfest across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to be notified of the upcoming sessions, and stay tuned to JLF Toronto's website jlflitfest.org/Toronto for the full schedule and information about our program. Ladies and gentlemen, Hphenations, the home and the world. Diksha Basu, Shauna Singh Baldwin, Kathy Friedman, and Anar Ali in conversation with Siddhesh Inamdar. Siddhesh, over to you.
Hello, good morning, and a very warm welcome to all the viewers of this session of JLF Toronto from this very cold day in Canada, where we have just started receiving the first snowfall of the season, or at least in the part of Canada where I am. The subject for this session is Hphenations, Home and the World, where we are going to talk about diasporic writing and how diasporic writers address a range of themes related to migration, displacement in their writing. And so without further ado, let's jump into the discussion. To start the discussion, I just wanted to quickly read a passage, a little paragraph from Anar Ali's Night of Power, her novel which came out a couple of years ago, which I thought would be a good starting point for today's discussion. So this paragraph goes, he was just a baby when they left, and there are no pictures of him from there. None of his parents either, as if they never existed until they arrived in Canada, which is fine by him. He has never been back and has no desire to go either. He is Canadian. Not that people always accept that when they ask him where he's from. No, but where are you really from? As if they are border guards and he's trying to enter the country illegally. It leaves him feeling that he doesn't belong here. But he doesn't belong anywhere else either. He's perpetually in limbo, no man's land. So I thought that would be a good point to start today's discussion. As diasporic writers or just people who are part of the diaspora, I'm sure this is a question that you have encountered often. I know I have. as a newly minted member of the diaspora who arrived in Canada only 6 months ago. And so, even though I won't quite put it like that, I thought it would be good for us to start the discussion by just talking about our personal journeys and where and what and in what way they have shaped our writing. So I would like to invite the writers on the panel with me today to briefly talk about your personal journeys and how you came to be part of the diaspora and how that has shaped your identity or how you write as diasporic writers. Anar, would you like to start since I just read a paragraph from your book?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think for me, my history is my family's from Kenya, Zanzibar before that, and my grandparents are from India on my father's side. On my mother's side, we're not absolutely sure. Likely India, but again, maybe there's some mixing in Zanzibar. And I bring that up because right from the beginning, it's a fractured history and an unknown history. And for myself, I grew up as an Ismaili Muslim, which in the Muslim world is considered not Muslim enough. And so, there's all these different fractures that I came to realize when I came to Canada. Until then, I didn't really realize. So in many ways, being born in Africa, not really African enough, not quite Indian enough. And then also my family, I speak Kutchi, which is not a written language. And the arts itself isn't necessarily something that's really revered in my community. And I bring that up because that's another fracture. And then growing up in Canada, that also created fractures. So for me, the writing has really been about trying to coalesce those identities to try to find a sense of home. And I'm not sure it's definitely helped ground me, but I still feel a constant sort of ache for home. And the only place I've really felt that is when I lived in Mexico, of all places. And I felt so at home there. And I'm actually now a permanent resident of the country. So I haven't been splitting my time, but that's the hope because interestingly enough, it has a lot of India. It has a lot of modernity. It has this sense of the old world and new world meeting. And, all of us would belong there, like in terms of physically. Never have I been in a place where I look like the people and they don't question me. So that it was like a relief to be there. So I'll say that. That's kind of where I'm at right now.
And how has your experience as a member of the diaspora shaped your writing? Your first collection of short stories, Baby Khaki's Wings, your first novel, Night of Power. Are you conscious of your identity as a diasporic writer as you're writing, or do these influences creep into your writing without you knowing, or that's just part of your being, so there's no escaping them either? What's your take on that?
I think it's a bit of everything, or a bit of all those things that you mentioned. In one way, there's no escaping it. It's your body and you're living in this. And then also, I don't know how the other writers' experiences were, but my own experience is that it became very, very clear when I was working with editors. This kind of I need to explain things that was very frustrating. And I always think of Toni Morrison's words where she says, I always feel emotional saying it, but this idea that, there's always that little editor or something, or the white person sitting there, whatever you want to call it. And she always says, flick that person off when you're writing and don't worry about it. And I don't know if I've always been successful. I've often thought when I look at my writing, have I been successful at that? I'm not sure. But I do think you end up being I have felt more conscious of it than I think other writers would. I don't know about other writers. Some writers would feel. But definitely I come to my writing from a place of wanting to really look at families, gender, the sense of an ache for home, not just countries and cities, but also in our communities, in our families, and sometimes in our own bodies. So.
Thank you. Thank you for that very thoughtful answer. Shauna, I would like to come to you next. I know you will have a different take because I understand that you were born in Canada, but you have also written about the immigrant and the diasporic experience, starting with your short story collection, English Lessons and Other Stories, published some 20, 25 years back. So what has your personal journey been like, and how has that shaped your writing?
Well, the diaspora that I feel most part of is actually the partition diaspora, which means that but for partition, my family my parents would never have met. I would probably be in a little village in Rawalpindi, today. So just the fact of my existence is the product of the partition of India and Pakistan. So that's one aspect. The other, very comfortable in Canada because I'm born there, So I don't have this feeling of being a migrant or an immigrant into Canada. But since my parents had that experience, and since I have that experience living in the United States, I do have an understanding of how it feels. So, when you write, you don't necessarily have the exact experience of your characters, but you certainly can relate to that experience in some fashion. So that's what I count on, really, is that scattered identity of mine, because you see, the opposite of hybridity and hyphenation is purity. And so that's what I write against. I try very hard to make sure that I reject purity, except in the case of milk or cement or gold, right? I mean, those are the things that we want to have pure, but I certainly don't want my life, my social life, to be pure, because as Malcolm Gladwell has pointed out in The Outliers, or, the hubs, the bridge people are where the richest connections are made. And then also, if you look at mathematics and small world theory, the hubs that are in those small worlds are, again, how we even create the topology that leads us to have air travel or bus travel or anything like that. So any place that you want to get from here, you need hybridity, and you need the outliers, and you need the bridges. And so I attempt to be that as well as to enjoy that. And so purity is the enemy, yes.
And given that you've been writing for several years, you've written collections of short stories, you've written novels. How have you experienced your diasporic experience shaping your writing?
Well, I think that when you want to make a character round, to rescue them from being flat, right? So what is a flat character? Well, a flat character is usually the one that has just their occupation, and they're in the background of a story. As soon as you give a character a name, you have to choose their social status. You have to choose their caste if they're Indian. You have to choose their backstory. Even if they're a teeny weeny character, you have to know so much about them to create them. So hybridity comes into it because you have to find something that you can relate to as the writer, but also something that a wider audience can relate to in the character. So I think if you're creating any characters at all, as soon as you give them a name, you're giving them the hybridity that you are going to have in conflict with something. And I mean, for me, all of the conflict in my writing comes out of the hybridity of the characters, because they're going to relate to one aspect of life, in one direction, and then say, oh no, but I belong to this other part as well. as we all do in real life, I mean, fiction is a reflection of real life, and none of us are one story only.
Thank you. Diksha, coming to you next. Tell us about your journey to North America and how that has shaped your writing.
I loved what Shauna said about hubs, because I feel I've sort of like collected homelands along the way my whole life.
Yeah.
And I was born in Delhi. I grew up in Delhi. I moved around a lot. My parents are restless academics who took us along with them everywhere we went, including for like 3 months in Sweden over the summer, just wherever they sort of felt like taking us. And we went along, and I loved it. I always loved it. And I never felt like an outsider anywhere. And I think this is my parents sort of pushed this into me, where I just sort of claimed every place for myself. And I find I still do that as an adult. Now I'll go somewhere on vacation and I'll start looking up real estate, right? And like, oh yeah, I could live here. I could live anywhere. And so I think one of that is because I don't barter much in nostalgia. This is not to say I've achieved some kind of present mindfulness. I'm terribly anxious about the future, but I don't think much about the past. I sort of take what I have to take from it and I move on. And so I think of Delhi as home. I think of India as home. I think of Bombay as home. I think of New York as home. My husband's a New Zealander. I think of Auckland as home. And so I've just stolen all these places and allowed them to be a part of myself, rather than worrying about myself as an outsider, because, well, that's no fun. I mean, I'd rather sort of steal everything for myself. I'd rather be selfish about it and take it. And that falls into my writing, because I allow myself to dip in and out of characters who may not look like me, who may not have my background, who may not have my upbringing. I write what I don't know. I write in order to know what I want to know, not what I know. And so my writing is like the sort of bits and pieces of that. And I think my ideas of home, my ideas of belonging, it's, partially it's that I've just sort of done this my whole life. And I married someone who's similar. He's a white New Zealander who was born in Chennai. And we met in Bombay, where we were both sort of passing through. And we both have had this ease of movement through the world, which is a very privileged thing. I'm saying I'm aware of that. But we've had this ease that hopefully now, we've got 2 small children and we want to put into them as well, this ability to not see yourself constantly on the outside, because that's a lot of self-victimization that goes on these days, I think. And so this desire to take the best from what you can, because really, what are nation-state lines but arbitrary lines? What are borders? They're nothing. They're meaningless. The concept of race is meaningless. And I think we're increasingly seeing all of this break down. And it's a really exciting time for me to be working where there is more of this allowance for it to break down. Again, I speak from a very specific perspective, well aware. But I find that really fun, this ability to fantasize, this ability to go on holiday to Mexico, like you mentioned. I love Mexico City, and to think I should move here. We should live in Mexico City, and to do that everywhere I go, and to never quite put roots down. I do think about it a bit differently now that I have kids, because I see what stability does for them. I see what a home does for them, but they're resilient. Every time we pack up and move, and we've done it several times already in their young lives, they pack up and move with us. And so for me, it's been that idea of hubs that you were saying, but this collecting homes. And I think that's also partially, I'm very good at making friends, and I hold on to friends, and friends mean a lot to me. And these are friends from every walk of life, friends from every city that I've lived in, every neighborhood I've lived in. Social media and the phones obviously make it easier, but I'm very good at staying in touch with people. And I think that speaks to also this sort of collection of abundance, these riches that I feel so lucky to have, be it culturally, be it socially, however I want to define it. And that's what I hope I bring into my writing. I've been very fortunate, unlike what Anar was saying, I've been very fortunate to have a team in North America, which is, where my books usually go first. I have a team that's never asked me to explain myself. I have a team that has allowed me to write as if I were writing for my grandmother in a housing complex in Delhi. And I've been so grateful for that. I have not had that pushback. So that's been the experience so far, and what I sort of hope to keep bringing into it. And right now I'm sitting in Brooklyn. There's a Greek Orthodox church behind me. And maybe I could pop into a service there as well.
Have you written as different people? Have you written as different religions, for instance?
I have, yeah. Well, I've written, the ones I know closest, which is Hindu and Muslim and Christian. Though that's what my family is made up of. So that's what I know enough to be able to write authentically. So I do. I've written different races, different sexualities, different different gender identities. I do play around with that, and I find it, that's why we all do it, right? It allows us to live so many lives in this one, like you said, the hybridity of our lives. It allows us to not just have an office job, to not just have this solo identity. So to me, that's the joy of writing, is to be able to fantasize about what could have been, because otherwise every decision we make as we get older sort of limits every other possible decision. And so that's what I love about being able to move, being able to travel, being able to be fluid in my identities, as well as being a writer as a profession, because it lets me see what could have been, even though I chose this path.
I really like what you said about claiming every place as your own. This is the first time I'm living outside India, but I have lived in a few places in India. I've lived in Bombay, Delhi, Chennai, and now I'm in Canada. And I find that claiming each place as your own is really the only way to make something of your life in that new place. So I appreciate that perspective, and I try to follow that in my life as much as I can. Kathy, I wanted to ask you, like Anar, you have come to Canada from Africa, but also at a very young age. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you identify as a diasporic writer, and what impact has that had on your writing?
Yeah, I'm happy to go last, because I've just been so fascinated hearing the other responses. I definitely identify as a diasporic writer. I think some of it is also, my religious background, which is Jewish, and it's, I think, setting aside something like, political Zionism and that kind of thing, there's just baked into the kind of DNA of the religion, this idea of exile, this idea of wandering, of diaspora. And so certainly I grew up I grew up in a fairly conservative family, having that education very much a part of my life, like we are diasporic. And so I think what I did, though, is I transposed as a young child this longing, the supposed longing that I was supposed to feel, I don't know, for Jerusalem, let's say. I'm a fairly secular person, certainly have strong criticisms around, things that the political situation in the Middle East and in Israel, Palestine. But I sort of transposed my longings for a homeland that I was supposed to feel as a Jewish person, and put that onto South Africa, which I left when I was so young, and just always wanted to go back. My family goes back a few generations in South Africa. My dad's father was Yiddish speaking as his first language, and my great-grandparents came to Africa and are buried there. I don't know beyond that where I'm from. There's a lot of fracturing as an Ashkenazi Jew. There's a lot of exile and being displaced. And so for me, home is Canada, because I grew up here. And because of the privilege, white privilege, my skin color, I'm not often asked, like, where are you really from? I don't often get those questions and that doubt and that sense that you don't really belong here, do you? And of course, having grown up here and speaking English as a first language as well. I do get asked sometimes as a Jewish person, well, do you feel more Jewish or more Canadian? And I'm like, I don't know what that means. How do you define a Canadian? That is, there's a lot of assumptions in a question like that. So yeah, I think I grew up with a lot of sense of fracture, a lot of sense of as a queer woman, as a woman with mental health issues as well, I grew up with just all kinds of questions around my identity and where do I belong, where do I fit in. and always looking towards, always yearning for somewhere. So growing up in the suburbs of Toronto, it was downtown. It was about, being somewhere where it was more diverse, where there were more people like me who were just creative and weird and, alternative, or whatever words it was. And then thinking about my parents and how they always had a conception of themselves as British. They were this kind of more British than the British colonial identity. And, looking at that, or looking at how a Jewish people, diasporic Jewish people, and this sort of longing for a homeland in the Middle East. And I really took those feelings, I think, and put that into my book. I think All the Shining People is my first book. It's a collection of short stories. And I think that sense of fracture was really important to why I chose to write a collection of short stories, linked thematically in some ways, and some of the characters recur, but not following one trajectory. So I was very much conscious of that. And I think Anar mentioned sort of the idea of writing towards wholeness. And I don't think that's what I'm doing. I think that, like Shauna, I'm really interested in hybridity for its own sake and as its own really legitimate form of identity and storytelling. And what I'm looking for as a writer is really just to make space for my different identities, and not just my own, but different gender identities, writing from different racialized characters, writing from different points of view, trying on different ways of being in the world and making space for them and saying this is legitimate. And certainly in my collection, I was looking for, where do we belong? How do we find a sense of home? How do we find a sense of belonging? And how do we connect? How do we connect when we've come out of an apartheid, if we've come out of an apartheid system, to a country, Canada, that is very much a colonial country, very much has ongoing issues of systemic racism. How do we connect to ourselves, to our innermost selves, and as well as to the communities around us in Toronto. My stories mostly take place in an extremely diverse city. So these were all questions that I think come from my own life, and then absolutely I was looking to answer them in my writing, but also just make space for them, make space for these weirdos and distinct and interesting lives.
Thank you for that perspective. I think we've touched upon a few issues associated to diasporic writing. And Diksha, I wanted to come back to you to talk about some of the unique challenges associated with writing as a person from the diaspora. What, according to you, are these unique challenges of writing as a diasporic writer? For your novels, you've always chosen subjects that travel very well, whether it was Bollywood with Opening Night, or the Big Fat Indian Wedding with Destination Wedding, or the city of Gurgaon, which is so American in its aspirations, in The Windfall. So you've chosen subjects that travel very well. Is it something that you're always conscious of when you decide to embark on a new project, that the subject, the topic has to resonate well with an Indian audience, also an American or a Western audience? Or are these subjects you've chosen because that's been your life? How has that shaped your writing?
Yeah, I like that question. Thank you. No, I write first and foremost for myself. It's become a little bit challenging because I do have an audience now, and it's hard to completely shut that off. But every time I start, I do start without an audience in mind. I think at most I think about, can I make my parents laugh? Would my grandmother have enjoyed this book? I go really minute into my audience. I go really into the people I know the most intimately, the people who I love, whose intellect I respect. Will my husband, who's white but knows India very well, will he like this? That's where I start. And I also start with my characters. I don't start with the big themes. Those do seem to come along because I enjoy lavish big pop culture. Like I enjoy the big movies, I enjoy the big budget films, I enjoy that. So that sort of seems to come naturally. But when I start writing, I start from the characters up. I always start to sort of live with my characters, breathe with them. I can imagine them entering into a room where I am at any given moment and exactly what they would do. And so those nascent stages of writing for me are so deeply intimate, so deeply personal. I don't share them with anyone. I don't tell my agent. I don't tell my husband. I don't tell my parents. I sort of start to live and breathe with these characters, imagine them existing in the world. And then when they start to find their footing, when they start to become a bit more wholly realized, when they start to take shape for me in a way where I start to ignore my friends, where I start to ignore my loved ones because these characters have become so real, that's the point at which the bigger stories reveal themselves. But that often, it sounds so sort of hippie writer style, but they really do reveal themselves, these stories and their journeys, once the characters are formed, because by that point I know the characters' motivations, I know the characters' loves and desires and insecurities, and so the rest sort of falls into place. I have to say, with The Windfall, which was my sort of big North American first book that came here and got a lot of attention, I did not expect the attention it got. And I think there's a tendency to talk about doors slammed in our faces, or desire for explanations, or desire for this, that, and the other. But I actually had the book went into auction, and I went into these meetings with these white editors who'd be like, oh, this could be my grandmother in Westchester. And I hadn't even thought about that, but I think there was a natural universality that came to it because so much of these stories were so universal. Because I was writing about a family that suddenly comes into a lot of money. I'm sorry about that, it's almost gone. I was writing about a family that suddenly comes into a lot of money. And so the cultural disconnect was happening within a culture. And increasingly in the world, right, the sort of class stratification that we're seeing goes across cultural lines, and it's cut by financial lines. So the top 1% anywhere in the world has a much more similar, has much more holding them and binding them in common than they do with people from somewhere else in the economic strata of their own country, which is why, again, what I went back to about this idea of nation-state borders just sort of being meaningless, increasingly so, because travel is so at our fingertips. Technology is making the world accessible. Streaming networks means we can watch Korean shows in our living rooms wherever in the world we are. And so that's what to me is so interesting, and what allows me, I think, the freedom to not think about those things. I start with my characters. I fall in love with my characters because of my life. They tend to be somewhat international. And that's it. And then I sort of go from there. So no, these are not things I consciously think about. In fact, increasingly, I try very hard not to think about these things and to go back to the fiction, because I'm not writing fiction to educate. I'm not writing fiction to teach. I'm writing fiction to entertain. And I think sometimes writers lose sight of activism versus fiction, and they don't always have to be tightly braided together. You can just sort of write without explaining my Indianness. That's what I aim to do.
Shauna, I wanted to touch upon a different element of diasporic writing.
Indeed.
How gendered do you think is the diasporic experience? I was reading English lessons and other stories, and you often write from the woman's perspective, from the woman's voice, whether it's Rawalpindi 1919 or Montreal 1962, Toronto 1984. There is this gradual progression through the generations, and the concerns of the diasporic voice change. So how gendered do you think that experience is?
Well, it's very gendered.
Question for sorry.
Sorry?
Sorry, Shauna. Sorry.
Okay. I said it's very gendered in the sense that so many women are, at least up to about the 1970s and 80s, coming over here to North America without consent, really. They're coming in the wake of a husband's job, a spouse's job. So up to about the 1980s or so, it's very rare for a woman to come by herself, of her own volition, self-selected for the purpose of, becoming an immigrant. That's really unusual. And it's happened more so in the computer generation. for us. So the gendered nature of the diaspora is this imbalance that has come about, and also throwing the entire power structure into the hands of one gender. I guess you can imagine which. So as a result, the lower power person in that relationship is pretty often the woman. That's changing, as we have more freedom even in India and abroad. And women are not taking things, as easily anymore. And because families are supporting women much more. At the same time, we've also had suicides recently of H-1B visa holding women. And that's been because there's no way for women whose passports have been taken away, or domestic workers, or H-1B visa holding women to work or to get some sense of their own independence. So there's a huge problem in the diasporic community of domestic violence. I know women who've gone to jail over it, just because they have to fight back in some way, So yes, the experience of gender in itself, or our gendered diaspora, however you want to put it, has an imbalance in power. And if you have it in real life, it shows up in your fiction. So.
Anar, I wanted to pose that same question to you. One of the very interesting things while reading Night of Power for me was the different perspectives of Mansoor and Laila and Ashif. Mansoor has this very, he feels Canadian. He almost has this personal sense of loyalty to Pierre Trudeau, while Laila is more comfortable in some ways. She is comfortable holding on to her older customs. So do you sense that difference in the diasporic experience between men and women? And how have you tried to portray that in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is how I grew up, So the book is not autobiographical, of course, but it is something that I, at least in the community I grew up in, it was very much about shrekking the old, like really embracing the new and adapting. So, and that comes from a history, like Kathy was saying, of, migration and multiple migration. So, you have to adapt. But sometimes what ends up happening is you're so keen on adapting, you end up losing some old things that maybe you could have held on to. Because there's an Arabic term called taqiya, which is really about blending in completely and keeping your own personal, like your real identity hidden. Because when you have a history of persecution, that's kind of what it's a survival mechanism. So I didn't intend to do this, but it came out naturally, a little bit like what Diksha was saying is, I actually start with characters and who I'm drawn to. And sometimes also an image comes to me. Like for me, the very first page of the book never changed in all the years that I was writing it. It's a story about, I always kept having this image of a man on a huge snowfield. And I knew there'd been an accident. I thought it was a plane accident. I kept seeing like a bird of some sort coming to kind of help him because he'd been encased in ice. And that has never changed. So that's a bit of a tangent. But I think that for me, the idea of looking at gender was really important because I think for me, it was also it's much easier. It has been, in what I've noticed is for the generations, at least of my parents, as a man, it was much easier to belong in some ways here than a woman. If, for instance, for my own mom's experience, she was forced to drop out of school at grade 5. Her English wasn't great. She was a bit asked to stop driving, and she was a bit scared of this driving in the snow. So, the accessibility to the community you're living with is different. So whereas if the men are going out and having a broader sense of being able to claim this place as theirs, the women, in my experience, were sometimes holding on to community, and whether it was the Jamaat Khana, and kind of building their worlds there. And so that can also sometimes create friction in the house if there's a sense of wanting to go forward and modernity, and if another part of the family doesn't necessarily want that, especially because if it's not fitting for them. So those were the kind of tensions that naturally came out of the characters that I was writing about. And then Ashif as the son, which often happens in certain diasporic or immigrant families, is trying to reconcile all these things, so kind of circling back to what Kathy said, I know there's this idea of, I'm not writing necessarily towards wholeness, but I'm writing towards a sense of taking all those fractures and making something of it. Because if you're grounded, for me, it's felt like that the ground is always shifting under me. So writing has been a place to create home, and gender plays quite a role in it for me. I don't know if that made sense. I hope it did. Yeah.
It did. And I understand we are running out of time, but I wanted to come back to you, Kathy, to end the session, because as I was reading All the Shining People, I felt that the stories take us to the heart of what we are discussing right now, which is this quest for belonging. You briefly touched upon that when you spoke earlier, but I wanted to talk about the sense that I got while reading the stories, that all these characters are searching for their safe space, which is also something you mentioned, that you wanted to create space for these characters, whether it's the model who's stripping herself emotionally as well as literally, or the 5 or 6-year-old boy who's moving to Canada and he's internalizing all that guilt and trauma of the move. So that is something I found quite unique about the story. So I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on this attempt to create space for your characters, and this attempt on the characters' part to search for a safe space of their own in the world.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and as well, thank you for that interpretation of the book. I think, yeah, it was at the heart of it for me, and I was that search for belonging, and that search for connection and a sense of safety, and I think that for me, that sense of safety can. It comes from within ourselves, but it can also only be found, I think, in community or in connection, whether it's to other people or whether it's to the land, to our environment. There was a quote from the Chicana writer, Gloria Anzaldúa, that really influenced me when I was writing the book initially. And she says, she's a wonderful writer and theorist who writes about hybridity and borders and crossing borderlands, or living at a borderland. And she says, there's no such thing, there's no pure object and there's no pure subject. We are implicated in each other's lives. And I just love that, and it very much goes back to the South African philosophy of Ubuntu, and that our humanity is bound up in each other's. And I think that yeah, when I was writing the book, and even the title sort of gestures towards that, just the idea of finding a place where we can just kind of exhale and be, and how fraught it can be to find that place, and how difficult, whether we're migrants, whether we just feel like we don't fit in. I think I really identified with the gender dynamics that Shauna and I were talking about as well, that what I found in my family as well was that my mother was very much still connected, much more connected to South Africa than my father. And this idea, though, of living in different places in our heads, where are we living physically and where are we living nostalgically or in our heads? Where do we feel that we belong? Where do we feel we are? Again, speaking to this kind of very British sense of identity. It's like, well, we were never British. We came from the shtetl in Eastern Europe, like my family never lived in England. And yet there's such a focus on Englishness and Europeanness, which of course is very colonial. And how do we break out of these mindsets? I'm very inspired by and wanting to delve more into Yiddish culture and more into this culture where you can, I don't know the language, for example, I'd love to learn the language and learn more, read more Yiddish literature, even in translation, because to me, there's very much a sense of like, we make our home where we are, and what Diksha was talking about in terms of being able to put down roots wherever you find yourself, and not just put down roots, but build a language and a community and a artistic tradition through in a place of exile and in a place of homelessness in a sense. And so I'm very interested in that, kind of going towards the future in terms of where I'd like to go in terms of my fiction, because I think there's also just a rich kind of queer Yiddish tradition that draws me as well. So I hope I've answered your question, in terms of how I was influenced and what was influencing me to try to create a space of belonging and a space of the value in hybridity and the value in some of these fractures that so many of us experience.
Thank you for that perspective, Kathy. And I think we are completely out of time now, but I think that's a beautiful note to end the session on. Just the idea of making a home for yourself and putting down roots where you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deeksha, Shauna, Kathy, Anar, and Siddhesh for that wonderful session. And sincere thanks to everyone that joined us online for this virtual edition of JLF Toronto. We'll be back in person next year.